Buddy, we see people still coming into the room. This is Jeff Martin with Magic City Books. We're so thrilled to have you here with us tonight. We've been doing a lot of these virtual events the past few months, but I have to be honest that this is one I've been looking forward to for many, many weeks, and something that, as kind of a personal bucket list, wish list for me. Colson Whitehead is one of my favorite writers personally, and I think one of our most important American writers. So to be able to do something, unfortunately, virtually, we certainly would love to do it in person, but to be able to have this conversation is a really special moment and honor for us. So I just wanted to put that out there. I'll tell you about a couple things coming up. We have events lined up all the way through August and into September right now. We're mostly doing them on Monday nights and Thursday nights. I hope you guys will join in more. You can go to our website, magiccitybooks.com, and do that. Tonight, you guys bought a ticket to this event. Most of our events have been free. This event costs $10 to come to. One of the great things about that is that $5 of your ticket price is going to go directly to the John Hope Franklin Center for Reconciliation here in Tulsa, organization that does really important and vital work here in our community and beyond. And so you're going to be supporting them by watching this talk tonight. So thank you for that. Leading our discussion tonight is my pal, Ben Montgomery. Ben is a kind of like this badass reporter who's like a kind of a throwback. I feel like Ben's always kind of like this guy who 50 years ago would have like Scoop on his hat, like with a fedora or something. He's kind of one of those intrepid reporters. And Ben, we've had the great pleasure to do some events with Ben for his previous books. But if you don't know, the reason Ben Montgomery is leading our discussion tonight is because his reporting for the Tampa Bay Times kind of lit the sparked the fire that became the Nickel Boys and sent Colson on this journey. Ben is a Pulitzer Prize finalist in his own right as a journalist, and also runs a killer website called gangrey.com. That's GANGREY.com. Is that right? I think I got that right. But check that out. Support what Ben's doing. Check out his wonderful nonfiction books. And we're excited to have Ben doing that. And if you don't know the work of Colson Whitehead, I'm not sure why you're on this Zoom, but I will be remiss to say, two-time Pulitzer Prize winner, back-to-back. We're going through the three-peat here. This is like the 90, 92, 94 Bulls here we're going for. I will say this. I think all of you have read Nickel Boys and certainly probably Underground Railroad. If you haven't read Colson's backlist, please spend this time doing so. I will specifically say I'm a huge fan of Zone 1. And it's a great book well, maybe not the greatest book to be reading right now, but it really seems timely. And if you have time, read Zone 1. You're going to enjoy the hell out of that book. But go back and just go through the whole oeuvre. You'll have a great time with that. So I'm going to hand it over to Ben, who's going to serve as our moderator tonight. If you guys have questions, please throw those into the Q&A down here. And we will be providing some links here throughout in the chat where you can get a copy of Nickel Boys, which is just out on paperback right now. So I'm going to hand it off to Ben. Thank you, Colson, for doing this. We're really honored to have you here, and take it away, guys.
Hey, thanks, Jeff. I appreciate it. I'm coming to you all from the Clarion Inn in Anchorage, Alaska, where I've been vacationing for a couple of weeks with my daughters and my mother and stepdad and my girlfriend. So I'm glad to be here, and I'm hoping the internet connection at the Clarion Inn holds out for this whole thing. Colson, you and I have talked a couple of times before. I'm going to step back just a little bit earlier before we get into the Nickel Boys and ask you a question I'm sure you get a lot, but it's one that always interests me about folks in your position, two-time Pulitzer Prize winner. How and when did you know that you were pretty good at this thing called writing? When did was there a moment for you where you're like, I can do this, I can make a career out of this, I can get people to read my books?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, there are a few moments, and thanks to Magic City for hosting us, and Ben for, taking the time. I think I wanted to write from an early age. I read like Stan Lee comic books, Marvel comics, Stephen King, and watched The Twilight Zone, and I thought, oh, I'll make stories about robots and werewolves and stuff like that. I think when I was a journalist at the Village Voice, like I got out of college, And it was my first job working in the book section there. And the thing about The Voice is that if you're in the building, you could nag people for work. And so after a few months, I approached the TV editor for my first, big break into showbiz. And it was a think piece about the series finales of the shows Growing Pains and Who's the Boss. It was like 92. And I think, I made some weird, dumb jokes and people laughed. And I think I started writing more for like the book section and the TV section and the music section. And, when you write a good article, people are complimentary. And so that was like positive encouragement. And then when you write a dud article, like you use like the first person too much and it's really self-indulgent. No one says anything, so not to do it next time. And so so I think the first inkling I had, like, oh, I can do this, was being a journalist and writing in public. And then in terms of books, I thought, well, people like my journalism. I always wanted to write fiction. I'll just start. And then of course my first book was rejected by 25 publishers. So I think I became a writer when I realized I was not going to become a lawyer or a veterinarian. I was just going to write my next book and then get better at writing. And maybe one day people would publish it. I would get good enough to be published. And so I think once I committed to like the terrible lifestyle is when I really became a writer, I think.
And if that hadn't worked out, what would you be doing right now?
My dream job after this is like being a music supervisor for a poorly rated but critically acclaimed TV show, like finding 80s pop music for the credits or like the montage sequence. Like I love like music supervisor for The Sopranos or, so I think music supervisor on a TV show.
That's fantastic. Have you, so they announced in April, there's a second piece of work of yours won the Pulitzer Prize. Have you actually received that prize yet? Are they doing the traditional pomp and circumstance that they normally do with the acceptance?
No, well, they said it's postponed to the fall, but yeah, I don't want to be inside with anybody. So I don't know, like when I got the first time, which was crazy in itself, I had a trip planned to Australia. I didn't want to cancel it because it was very complicated. And so I flew to Australia and missed the ceremony. And the day of the ceremony, I was like, fuck, that was like my one chance to like be at this thing. And now I'm not sure if they're going to do it or what. There's like some prize money has not arrived yet. I don't know what the holdup is. So I think everything's on hold, but obviously it's a nice, surreal sort of thing to try to get my head around. So.
It probably comes with its own sort of pressure too, does it not?
All the books are hard in their own way, so you're broke and that's why it's hard. You're depressed, that's why it's hard. You're broke and depressed. So I think all the books are really hard to do. And I have enough internal pressure that I'm not really worried about other people's expectations. Like my own expectations are so warped and horrible that I have enough internal pressure without thinking about what other people expect from me.
Do you read criticism?
When the book comes out, I'll read like the first third of the reviews, and then like what a good review is and a bad review of the book is, and so after that, they're all pretty much say the same things. So I know there's some people who like I don't read reviews, and I have friends who are like that, and then like over the years are like, damn, I hate that critic. So you do read reviews? Is that what you're saying? So I think most people. Read your print stuff or take a peek on Amazon or Goodreads and book blogger 697 hates my book. He's given 1 star, so it's best to keep your sense of proportion.
Do you ever click on the Amazon 1-star, 2-star reviews?
Oh, I rarely do. Like last week I did, and like, it was like, it was Underground Railroad. It was like, why are all the white characters evil? It's like, one, that's not true. And also the slave masters, most of them in this book. So maybe it's not for you,
Yeah, didn't make my hair as shiny and smooth as it promised.
Totally, yeah. Yes, yeah. So, arrived damaged, 1 star. So.
Let's dip into the Nickel Boys.
Sure.
That's why everyone's here. Tell us how you stumbled on this story.
Yeah, I mean, it was 2014, and people like you had covered the story extensively in Florida papers, but I think it only periodically, reached the national stage for like a day or something, and then would disappear again. So I was on Twitter, and as I often am, and someone had linked to like an NPR report, and I never heard of Dozier before, and so I Googled it and quickly found, you're reporting, you've been writing about it for years. This was the summer of 2014. And I was immediately shocked that I never heard of it. It seemed like the story would have been much bigger. And also it was the summer of, the protests in Ferguson and Eric Garner getting killed in Staten Island. And, there's this real sense that people get away with terrible things. Police get away with killing unarmed Black people, and people like the staff at Dozier get away with physically abusing, sexually abusing, and of course we think, murdering their charges. And then they never call to account, they never go to jail, they get their pensions. And so, those twin injustices, what was going on in terms of police brutality, and then this one place like Dozier, it seemed like if there was one Dozier, how many other places, reform schools or juvenile detention facilities, where the same thing is going on are there, but we never hear about them. And so it was just that summer I felt really raw, and coming across the Dozier story, your reporting made us stay with me.
Did you ever have a brush with the justice system when you were a teenager?
Well, I think, most young Black men and women are, stopped or detained or have some sort of, interaction, which can escalate to something lethal if things don't go your way. And so, one time I was with two friends, one white, one Native American. We're sort of like a mod squad, but we were in a supermarket getting some beer, and a policeman pulled me out, handcuffed me, and took me out to a squad car. And a white lady had been mugged like 2 blocks away. And I fit the description, young Black male. And luckily she was in the car, and so it was like, no, that wasn't him, And my friends were protesting, but on a different street, a different set of circumstances, you never know what happens. And so that story is fairly common and not very unusual. And, the last 10 years, we've seen what happens when it goes the wrong way.
Yeah. How did you settle on these characters, Elwood and Turner?
Yeah, I mean, for me, part of the fun part of the job is making things up. So I'm not a journalist, I'm not a historian. I knew that I wanted to take Dozier and the story, the general outlines, and populate it with my own characters. And so Elwood came first. He's like the first protagonist we meet. And he's a goody-goody, straight A student. He's inspired by Dr. King and the protest movement. And he hitchhikes with the wrong person en route to the college classes. He's like he's in high school taking college classes. Hitches with the wrong person. It's a stolen car, gets sent to Dozier. And so for me, he was a stand-in for all those sort of young Black men and women who are at the wrong place at the wrong time and had their lives changed. And someone who's so good, like Elwood, sort of calls out for his opposite. So Turner, our secondary protagonist, came pretty quickly. And he, as Dozier was a place for juvenile delinquents, but also orphans, people who were wards of the state, had nowhere else to go. It was basically a warehouse for kids. And so he's an orphan, Turner, and as opposed to Elwood, doesn't think that the social order can be changed. People are fixed, the system is fixed and rigged, and all you can really do is look out for yourself. And so they start, unlikely friendship, this optimist and this pessimist, and they both sort of, describe each other as the book goes on.
Do you ever say why Turner was committed? I'm struggling to remember now.
Just it was some trumped up thing like vandalism, I think. and his parents are dead. He has relatives in Texas, which he doesn't tell the state about. So it's like vandalism.
Yeah.
If I remember, I haven't thought about it. Wow.
And that's another question. Do you, after the thing comes out, after your book is published, do you reread it? Do you reread it? Do you ever revisit your own work?
Yeah. Well, I remember like when I was a journalist, like I really nailed that Happy Days joke, like in my TV columns. I was like a TV columnist. So I think with this book and definitely Zone 1 and Underground Railroad, like the final like 30 pages are really, really strong. And I felt that when I was writing them, and I felt that in the months afterward. And so before the books came out, I would look and think, okay, I did a good job. I did what I wanted to do. I feel proud of the work. It's not so much when it comes out because you're talking about it so much and then it becomes something else. Definitely the older the book, the less I look at it. So I haven't opened the Intuitionist or John Henry Days in a long time. When I do, I'm like, I was pretty smart back then, if uncontrolled. But definitely the publicity cycle talking about it does make it more remote. And usually I'm writing something else at that point. So I'm thinking about the next thing.
So much of what you've written is based in reality. For instance, the hierarchical structure inside of the school among the students, the different rankings and so forth. And the description of the place rings very true to me, what I know of Dozier. The big thing that's missing that doesn't show up in your book is the character. I've written a lot about this very real man who's missing an arm, named Troy Tidwell, who is the non-fictional antagonist in so much of this story as we've reported. He is the guy that all of these White House boys talk about as being the worst disciplinarian. I just a question: why stick so close to the truth and leave out the biggest villain of the whole thing?
Sure. I mean, the superintendent I make up is the main villain. Yeah. Instead. Well, there's some things you want to keep because they're too good to be true. Like the place where the kids were whipped was called the White House. And of course the residence with DC, you can't get rid of. A one-armed sadist who beats people for decades doesn't work.
Right.
It's the reality of the book.
Right.
I mean, look, it's too over the top. So pretty quickly I knew that he was not going to be a one-armed guy. Yeah. He would just be, sadistic in his own way, and I could adapt him to Elwood and Turner and what the book needed. Yeah. I'm always like thinking of different models, and I really want him to look like the senator in Godfather 2, who's like always dissing the Corleones, and it's always like, you Italian, greasy Corleones. And that actor, I forget his name right now, is so distinctive in my head as like a certain kind of 1950s villain. And so in my head, he's not Tiswell, but the guy who plays the senator in Godfather 2. So.
That begs a good question. Do you cast these things in your head based on actors and
Not so much the main characters, but the supporting characters, definitely. Yeah. And I'm always like, if I need a name and I see a movie the day before, it'll go in there. So Intuitionist, I watched Psycho, and the next day I made this investigator look like Martin Balsam, and I took the name Arbogast from Psycho and put it in the book. If I see my friend Mike on Tuesday and on Wednesday I need a name, the evil doctor is going to be named Mike, just because that's a name in my head. Right. So I don't cast the main people, and I really can't see their faces, but definitely supporting cast sometimes. I'll go to a lot of 50s and 60s movies.
Yeah. There's a question from Julia that I think falls in the right place here. She says, Mr. Whitehead, I don't want to spoil the ending for people who've not yet read your novel, but I'm wondering if you had the idea for the twist. that little surprise ending when you started to write, or if it came to you somewhere in the process. Did you know, and I won't say what happens so we don't spoil this.
Yeah, I mean, I do a lot of outlining before I start. I have to know the beginning and the end, and the middle can be fuzzy. So with Nickel Boys, I knew the ending, but I didn't know what, say, Jamie and Desmond, the two sort of minor characters who hang out with Elwood and Turner, were like. I knew they had sidekicks, but I didn't know what they were like until they appeared on the page or a couple days before. With the major plot points, especially with a plot-heavy book, I sort of have to know before I start. So I plotted it out in the spring of 2016, and I didn't start writing until May of 2017. So that gave me, I could wake up at 5 a.m. like, how am I going to do this? This is crazy, and learn and think about calibrating my effects over time, and how am I going to pull things off and misdirect the reader and red herrings. And, with a plot-heavy book, it behooves you to do more planning in advance. And so with the Intuition is my first book. It takes off for detective novels, and there are red herrings and reversals. And so I was very much invested in knowing as much as I could before I started. And it was the same with the Nickel Boys. Well, thanks for reading.
I kept returning as I read to this through line that this whole thing revolves around the capacity to suffer. And I wonder if that was a clear thought for you with, in the summer of Michael Brown, if that sort of nugget of call from civil rights leaders of the past to love against suffering, if that was as clear to you early on in the writing process, the design process of this book, as it came through in these pages.
It's clear. It was there because I knew that Elwood would be allied with Dr. King. He works in a stationery store. He's been reading Time magazine and Life magazine and seeing the weekly reports on the civil rights movement, and sees himself as part of this revolution that's changing America. And early on, I was trying to figure out which of Dr. King's speeches would speak to Elwood and speak to the larger themes. But it really does seem really separate from how I exist in my real life. I mean, I think in 2014 and up till now, there's not that singular face or voice. There's not that Dr. King, Rosa Parks, avatar who is leading the way and giving us that sort of helping hand that we need to understand things, the charisma and intellect. Definitely in 2014, Black Lives Matter was more amorphous. I think what's sort of miraculous about the last month is that there's no one singular face. The people we think we associate with the movement are the dead, the people who've been killed, the Breonna Taylors and George Floyds. But there's no one figure who is sort of speaking what's on everybody's mind and heart. And despite that, the protests are so large and long-lived. They're still going on. They're not being covered, but they're still on in big cities and small. So even though we don't have that one person we can look to and be inspired by, they're still going on as a sort of mass movement. So that's what is sort of delightful about the last month and all the misery.
In keeping with that, Tracy asks, a lot of people have been returning to writers like James Baldwin and Oklahoma's own Ralph Ellison for wisdom in these times. She asks, could you talk about how your work might be in a conversation with these literary forefathers? Do you consider yourself, now that you've won 2 Pulitzer Prizes for books related to race relations, do you consider yourself a part of that? When we talk about Ralph Ellison, when we talk about James Baldwin, other Black writers, do you think of yourself in that conversation?
Those incredible people, and obviously just to be in the same sentence, is an honor. I worship them. I worship Toni Morrison, and I had to find. I think there's 1 or 2 quotes from James Baldwin and the Nickel Boys, because Elwood the two essay collections came out in Elwood's lifetime in his teenage years. And so I was able to, get him in there. And I hadn't read Baldwin in a few decades, and it was uncanny how relevant it was in 2017 when I was writing it, and what a singular and inspiring voice he was. So I learned a lot from Baldwin, a lot from Ralph Ellison and Toni Morrison and Gail Jones and the previous generation of African-American writers. I think I'm doing my own weird thing, but also I'm always eager to acknowledge my debt to them. They were writing at a much different time, and a lot of the stuff I do in terms of balancing the real and the surreal, I couldn't have done without the fantastic parts of, say, Ellison and Morrison.
Were you, my question now, were you tempted to give us readers an ending in which justice is served against those villains? Did that come up in any drafts?
When I was conceiving the book, I take notes on my phone so that they're there and in the cloud, I don't lose them. And the first two notes I wrote for the book were the innocent suffer and the guilty go unpunished.
Oh, wow.
And so when I wrote in my file, that's the two things I read. And the unpunished are the policemen who suffocate, who shoot unarmed people in the back. It's Tidswell, the guy at Dozier. It's the guards who are never called to account. And the innocents who are nameless, who are in the ground in unmarked graves. And we may never know who they were or what happened to them, just that they disappeared and no one really cared for them in the way they should have been. So I knew that some people would get out, some people wouldn't. But I think to be true to the stories of so many of the boys and the stories of the people in the unmarked graves that first brought me to the story, justice would not be done in any kind of real way.
There's another story that played out in Marianna, Florida, which you're probably aware of, 1934, the lynching of a black farmhand named Claude Neal, who was in his early 20s. He was killed by, if you trust the newspaper reporters on site, somewhere in the neighborhood of 5,000 people participated in his death and dismemberment. This was widely known, and the NAACP used his death and the photos that were taken of his corpse afterward to try to change the flavor of lynching for most Americans, and it worked to some extent. It's also a case where no one was ever named. No one was ever brought to account for an act that many historians have described as one of the most barbaric acts in American history. And since we're in Tulsa, the same can be said for the Tulsa massacre, in which some unknown number of black men, women, and children were killed by whites in town. There are efforts now to try to at least establish for the record what happened, who was involved on either side, at least name all of the dead and get some sort of body count that people can be confident in. I wonder if you have thoughts on whether that's starting to change. And I've only thought this most recently with the charging of the police officers in the George Floyd killing. That I felt like that for the first time, maybe in my life, was like a piece of satisfaction. And who knows how this trial would play out, because as we saw in Rodney King and other incidents, these guys sometimes get off scot-free. But the fact that the DA in Minneapolis was so quick to bring charges against these officers felt satisfying. And I wonder if you have thoughts on that. Is that starting?
Well, I think, we're talking about police brutality and de facto lynchings. It's been the same story for 200 years, and so nothing that's happening now is particularly new. But I was going through my notes for book talks and stuff like that. And last year I described Dozier, and I described the deaths of Michael Brown and Eric Garner. And I wrote in my intro, and just last week, William Barr dismissed all charges against the people who killed Eric Garner and this is the way it's always been. And so a year later, we have another death caught on video, but the police who have been charged immediately. There's not that 6 months and then another couple years for the trial, and then they get off. And so just even in a year, there's a tiny little bit of movement. A year ago, a lot of people didn't know about the Tulsa. From Twitter, I can tell people did not know about the Tulsa bombing and massacre because I guess Watchmen told everybody, which I found horrifying. But that's not taught. Lynching culture is not taught. I deal with that more in sort of Underground Railroad, where lynching culture in the South happens in the South Carolina section, and a black town is destroyed. Later on in the book, that's our history. Black prosperity is destroyed, canceled by an envious white village down the road, white town, white power in the vicinity who can't abide a black person having anything, and that's part of our history, and it's not taught. I mean, I learned about Tulsa 10 years ago, so I shouldn't make fun of people who just heard about it. It's not taught in our high schools. It is being taught in a much better way and thorough way now, and so it is progress.
Yeah. From Blake, I haven't quite read all your novels, but the ones I have read, there seems to be an interest in bureaucracy and industry, whether it is the elevators, elevator inspectors, stamp collectors, railroad drivers, etc. Do you have a conscious obsession with this? If so, what do you find so fascinating about the intersection between industry and corporation and those who labor underneath it?
I think this late stage capitalism is terrible. We're all enmeshed in how it works. And I think there's a lot of humor in how we're products, how we're perceived as products by corporations. And so much of the way we're defined, late 20th century, 21st century, is in terms of what we buy, how we consume, and are consumed. And, I think growing up in the 70s and 80s, there's that strong countercultural thread in pop culture. And so it's Richard Pryor, and it's like a hippie in a movie, it's George Carlin. So, I absorb a lot of that anti-establishment, countercultural energy. The movies like Brazil, I haven't seen in a while, but just that, the whittling down of your personality by bureaucracy, by big business, by these soulless corporations has been part of, I think my intellectual landscape from, just watching TV and movies as a kid. So it's in there and it's a source of horror and amusement.
Another reader asks, the two main characters and what happened to them was so haunting. She says, how do you debrief after you finish writing? And I would just jump on that. Does this affect you emotionally when you're in the work? And if so, how do you deal with that? Do you get counseling? Do you drink?
There's some wine involved, definitely. I mean, I think I'll do a serious book and then a more humorous book is my usual formula. And so I'm not living, in the world of slavery. But I sort of had to write The Nickel Boys. I just felt compelled in the spring of 2017 as I was wrapping my head around a Trump administration. Am I hopeful or not? And The Nickel Boys became a way for me to deal with that. Unfortunately, the subject matter is so terrible that, the last 6 weeks were very difficult. I had set Elwood and Turner on this tragic path, 2 years before when I was thinking about it. And as I got closer, I got more and more depressed. I've never been to Dozier. The further I got into the book, the more I got depressed thinking about going down there. I bought a ticket and a hotel, and I got a hotel room, and the day of was just like, I can't get out of bed. And so I never went. Ben, you're very nice to offer to take me around when I
Anytime.
Last year. And so this is the first time I sort of had that really emotional reaction. It was the stories of the survivors that I was reading, and I wanted to be true to their story and not get it wrong. I wanted to be true to the reality of life in the Jim Crow South. and it did wear on me. So to answer your question, I finished the book, and then for 6 weeks I played video games and barbecued for my family, and it was a really great 6 weeks where I just goofed off and was a weird man-child. And Ben, like, how did you deal with it? I mean, you talk to these guys all the time. You were there a lot, and
I honestly did not handle it well. This was, pretty steadily 5 years, and then more than that, 10 years of my life. And I drank too much. I wasn't present when I should have been with my kids. Bad relationships. It's not an easy thing to deal with. There are resources out there for people like me who are reporting on this kind of trauma. But and I knew that the whole time. But it was always good to come to Alaska or whatever, get away. I guess that's therapy, and also balance my reportage between Dozier and this dark stuff, and then once in a while do a story that that nobody would ever remember. People would read and throw in a recycling stack, and I don't know the best answer to that. I drank way too much, though. That was my thing, and remains a bit of a regret for me.
Was the relief to work on your new book, Shot in the Moonlight, which takes place in the distant past?
I was going to try to avoid this, but thank you, Colson. That's so kind of you.
Shot in the Moonlight coming out next year.
Coming January 2021. You know what? Interestingly, it doesn't have a nice, tidy ending like this one, and maybe that's a thing. The Black experience is not always happy. It turns out, especially in the 1890s.
South, yeah, and it's about a figure I never heard about. How did you hear about his story?
You're really turning the tables on me. Thank you. I owe you one. You know what? So I was looking for a satisfying story. I was trying very specifically to find a story about a Black man in our past where things kind of worked out in his favor, and I was, and this is going back 3 or 4 years, and I was searching like newspapers.com, the newspaper archives, for things like Negro and revenge and Negro and retribution, using the language of the day, and stumbled across the story of a guy who defended himself against a lynch party. 25 white guys had ridden up to his house at midnight and tried to kill him. And he, as Harriet Tubman said in 1894, the Winchester rifle should have a place of honor in every Black home. And he grabbed his Winchester rifle and returned fire, and set in motion this whole crazy chain of events that wound up with him suing the mob, his would-be killers, in federal court and winning. And I sort of found that, but it still didn't work out. Didn't work out the best for him. It was not even though he had, in this one crazy rare incident, he had sort of justice, legal justice, at least on his side. He still couldn't get paid.
He's still a Black man in racist America.
Still a Black man, yeah. So I wanted to ask you, though, before we run out of time, what is your experience in the South? Have you, tell us, have you spent much time?
I had a friend who taught at the University of Georgia, so I spent a lot of time in Athens, just 2 weeks here over the years. For book stuff, I was never invited down to the South a lot until Underground Railroad, and since then I've been to North Carolina a lot, and Florida, and South Carolina, but mostly sort of the coast. Like, I've not been to Tennessee, I've not been to Alabama and Mississippi, as opposed to the multiple trips, to the place I just mentioned. And so people were really eager to, talk about Underground Railroad and confront their own family's history. White people, how did their great grandfather buy the house that they grew up in and pass down this wealth? And so I think 10 years ago, 20 years ago, the book wouldn't have been received as well, and I wouldn't have been invited down as much. But as opposed to like a nonfiction book, if you show up, you know, you're on my side. It's not like you would protest. So you want to do the work if you're there, and you're engaged. It's not like I get picketed when I go to the South. Whereas I assume, you know, some sort of nonfiction would be more controversial. Yeah. Fiction readers are there because, you know, they're engaged with you and want to, you know, hear about the book from you. And so, so it's been nice to travel more in the South. I still have never been invited to Mississippi, and I've never read in certain places. It's sort of like, there's still like the sort of hole in the country I've never been invited to.
Not even Square Books in Oxford.
It's never worked out. I'd like to go there one day. You know, I heard they're really nice folks.
Yeah. Matt asks, in this time when we're having conversations about memorializing painful history, how do you think a place like Dozier should be memorialized, if at all?
I haven't thought about it, but I think, you know, memorializing that the story gets out and people know what would happen, and all the, you know, the silent sufferers who died anonymously, or who lived a long time and were never able to tell another living soul what happened to them, that the world sort of understands that this place existed and their stories out there. I'm not big into monuments and plaques, and definitely I think a bulldozer would not be out of place. What do you think, Ben, in terms of Dozier, having, you know, spent so much time?
I sort of like the idea that a man named Glenn Varnado had. His uncle died in custody in the 1930s, and he had spent decades trying to find his uncle's remains, and they were among those that were unidentified in that little cemetery. But Glenn had the idea of basically placing a billboard along I-10 that said, "This is where, you know, this is Florida's Auschwitz. This is where boys came to be broken and punished," and sort of turning it into like a sadistic theme park in keeping with, you know, with Florida's tourism. Yeah, just kind of an interesting thought. I'm not sure that's the right way to do it, but you know, I know it helped those guys, the White House boys, the Black boys of Dozier. It helped them in a big way, at least those that I've talked to, when the state formally apologized. I know they'd like to see some compensation for the pain they've suffered, you know, in the 50 years since they've been turned out of that place. But just to hear state lawmakers apologize, officially pass a resolution that said, "We are sorry for the way you were treated while you were in state custody," was such a big deal for them. I know it had an impact, and I think that's a good place to start when we talk about truth and reconciliation. Having the story out there is, in my mind, the biggest part of it. But these are guys, as you know, who returned to that campus, who you know, some of them decades later drove through Mariana with pistols on their laps, thinking about getting revenge against Troy Tidwell and some of the men who beat them and sexually abused them. So that's not something that's muted or dulled with an apology. Some of these guys still hold tight to that anger. Just say it's who they are. They live with that now. Couple more questions here. Jeff, I take it we're good on time, 4:48. I'm sorry, 7:48. What advice do you have for up and coming writers, Colson? How do you get your work out there? Where should you publish?
Yeah, in terms of getting it out there, you know, so different than when I started writing. There were newspapers, and there were alternative weeklies like The Voice that nurtured young writers. Like I said, if you're in the building, you could nag somebody for work. Definitely, you know, 15 years ago became the web, and you're writing for free or getting your name out there, writing for like the website of a paper as opposed to, you know, the paper. So I'm not sure about the mechanics of how you get known these days and that important apprenticeship, but you know, read as much as you can and read and read and read, and then write and write and write. You know, I was a crappy writer 30 years ago and I got better. If I wrote a shitty article, you know, I would sort of sense that I was being despised this week. Now I try to do better next week. But no one starts off being a great writer. You start off as a pretty bad writer and keep at it, like most things.
Another question from my friend RJ. I believe RJ's in Tulsa, who, by the way, is a writer himself. A nonfiction book called Let It Bang, a young black man's reluctant odyssey into guns. RJ asks, after 2 Pulitzers and a blessing from Oprah, do you face pushback from your publishing house when you've decided to pursue an idea? Do you get pushback from the house or your editor?
Well, yeah, no, they published me since the beginning. So, 22 years and 10 books. And so they've always been supportive. My first book was about a African-American elevator inspector. So they knew they were in for some weird stuff. And I definitely had some ups and downs, but they've always stuck with me. And so I've never had trepidation about sharing an idea. And I'm very fortunate in that way. I think they understood what they were getting into. And it's rare to be with a publishing house for that long. So I feel very lucky.
Jeff, are we good? Couple more, or what do you think?
Yeah, I think let's do a couple more, and then we'll wrap it up.
Sounds good.
I just lost this question. Oh, here's what I think is a pretty good one. What do you think Cora from Underground Railroad and Elwood from Nickel Boys would say to each other if they could meet? And what would they say to us?
I can't even make up a funny joke because they're so just like these things I created, and they have like they're in their box, and so I can't imagine anything that is not in the book.
They never come out and play together?
I'm not sure if they would have gotten along. Cora's doesn't really play well with others. I mean, Elwood would be really empathetic and like, show me on the doll what happened to you, and then Cora would be like, who the hell are you? So.
Elwood has King's words embedded in his brain from listening and re-listening to the records of his speeches. Do you have an album, record, cassette, CD, whether spoken word or music, that you listen to so many times the words are with you?
Not a speech or a spoken word artist, but I've always played music when I've done homework or in college writing papers, and now when I write, I play music. So I've been writing to like Purple Rain and like David Bowie for like 30 years, Kraftwerk. I remember this is like the 30th anniversary of the first Ice Cube record. I've been playing that for like 30 years, writing bad screenplays, like bad papers, like journalism and books. It's like Ice Cube, ranting to that Bomb Squad production from like 1990. And so, all that music, I play when I work, and it's always with me, and has kept me company in the good times and bad.
Is that for the rhythm? Is that because you know it so well? It's in the background. It's white noise.
It's in the background. I can sing along or not, or it's the Clash, and it's just like I like it, so I'm excited, and
I'm gonna have to try that. Jeff, any other questions on here that stand out? I haven't been able to make it through all of them.
I think we'll wrap it up. But I'm going to ask you two one question, which is this. I think, Colson, you did such a great job asking Ben some questions. Maybe we get this back together when Ben's book comes out, and we could kind of turn the tables. Maybe we'll do a little launch for Ben's book, and when that comes out.
Sure, that'd be cool. I'm not traveling that much. I'm pretty
Jeff, there's a way that we can get everyone who is buying Colson's work to also buy mine. Then, let's make this happen.
Yeah, I'm down for that too. That's good for the bookstore also. I just want to say a big thank you to Ben for moderating. A huge thank you to Colson for taking the time to do this. Also to our audience for watching and also for supporting independent bookstores and for supporting the work of the John Hope Franklin Center with your ticket today. So if you haven't gotten a copy of the Nickel Boys, please do so. You're going to really have a powerful experience with that. I think we've posted a few links to do that so you can get it through Magic City Books. And let's stay safe and have everybody back here hopefully in a few months when Ben's book drops, and we'll get the band back together and do this again.
Early.
All right.
All right.
Take
Stay
care,
safe, everybody. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Colson. Thank you, Jeff. This was great. Everybody buy that book, The Nickel Boys. Really fantastic. It said things about Dozier that I wish I could have said. It slipped inside the characters' heads in ways that are surprising and confirming and so very insightful to the human experience. So congratulations, Colson. You deserve all the accolades. And thanks, Jeff.
Thank you, sir.
Take care, everybody. Stay safe.
Take care, everybody.
Bye.